The jungle was silent except for the hum of insects and the distant echo of gunfire that had faded hours ago. Sergeant Thomas Hargrove pressed his back against the wet bark of a banyan tree, his breath shallow, his rifle clutched tight against his chest. Around him, the dense undergrowth of Guadalcanal stretched in every direction, a maze of vines, mud, and shadows. He had been cut off from his unit for 36 hours. No radio, no supplies, no way out. The last transmission he heard before the equipment shattered under mortar fire was clear. Retreat to the ridge, regroup at dawn. But dawn had come and gone. He was alone, and the Japanese were everywhere. He could hear them now. Faint voices carried on the humid air, the snap of branches, the metallic clink of equipment. They were searching, hunting. He had two options: wait to be found, or become the hunter himself. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Thomas Hargrove was 23 years old, a farm boy from rural Tennessee who had never seen an ocean until the troopship carried him across the Pacific in the summer of 1942. He grew up in the hills outside Knoxville, where his father ran a small tobacco farm, and his mother kept chickens and a vegetable garden that fed the family through the lean years of the Depression. Thomas was the second of 4 sons, quiet by nature, but known among his brothers for an uncanny ability to move through the woods without sound. His father taught him to hunt deer and turkey in the dense forests that bordered their land, and by the time he was 12, Thomas could track an animal for miles, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed leaves that others would miss entirely. He learned patience in those woods, learned to control his breathing, to wait for hours without moving, to strike only when the moment was perfect. His older brother, Robert, enlisted in the Army in early 1941. Driven by a sense of duty and a desire to escape the endless cycle of planting and harvest, Thomas followed a year later, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, when the local recruitment office was flooded with young men eager to fight. He told his mother he would be back before the tobacco needed harvesting. She did not believe him, but she kissed his forehead and pressed a small Bible into his hands, whispering a prayer he would remember in the months to come. Basic training at Camp Shelby in Mississippi was a blur of forced marches, rifle drills, and the constant barking of sergeants who seemed determined to break every man down to nothing before building them back up into soldiers. Thomas excelled at marksmanship, his steady hands and hunters earning him top marks on the rifle range. He was assigned to the 164th Infantry Regiment, a National Guard unit from North Dakota that had been federalized and retrained for jungle warfare. The men were tough, shaped by winters on the northern plains, but none of them knew what to expect when they boarded the transports bound for the South Pacific. The journey took weeks, island hopping through supply depots and staging areas, the air growing hotter and heavier with each passing day. They landed on Guadalcanal in mid-October, part of the reinforcements sent to relieve the exhausted Marines who had been holding Henderson Field against relentless Japanese assaults. The island was a nightmare. The heat was suffocating, the jungle dense and disorienting, and the enemy was everywhere, hidden in the trees, dug into bunkers, striking at night with ferocity that left men shaking in their foxholes. Thomas learned quickly that the war in the Pacific was nothing like the stories he had heard about Europe. This was not a war of lines and fronts. This was a war of shadows and ambushes, of invisible enemies who struck without warning and vanished in the jungle before you could return fire. The regiment was tasked with securing a ridge overlooking the Matanacar River, a strategic position that would allow American artillery to control the approaches to Henderson Field. The Japanese were determined to hold it, and for 3 days, the fighting was brutal and chaotic. Thomas's platoon advanced through the jungle under constant sniper fire, the crack of bullets cutting through the canopy, men falling without ever seeing who shot them. On the second day, they encountered a fortified bunker hidden beneath layers of camouflage and logs, its machine guns sweeping the trail and pinning the platoon down for hours. Thomas crawled through the undergrowth with 2 other men, circling wide to flank the position, his heart pounding so hard he thought the enemy might hear it. They tossed grenades into bunkers, firing slit, and stormed it as the explosions echoed through the trees. Inside, 3 Japanese soldiers lay dead, their bodies torn apart by shrapnel. Thomas stared at them for a long moment, the reality of what he had done settling over him like a weight. He had killed before at a distance, through the sights of his rifle, But this was different. This was close. Personal. He felt no triumph, only a hollow ache in his chest and the cold knowledge that there would be more. On the third day, everything went wrong. The platoon was advancing along a narrow trail when they walked into an ambush. The Japanese had set up positions on both sides of the path, waiting until the Americans were deep in the kill zone before opening fire. The sound was deafening, a roar of rifle shots, machine gun bursts, and the shouts of wounded men. Thomas dove for cover as bullets tore through foliage around him, splinters of wood and leaves raining down. He rolled into a shallow depression and brought his rifle up, searching for targets, but the enemy was invisible, hidden behind trees and rocks, firing from concealed positions. The platoon tried to fight back, but they were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Men were screaming for medics, shouting orders that no one could hear over the chaos. Thomas saw his platoon sergeant take a round through the chest and collapse, blood spreading across his uniform. He saw the lieutenant waving frantically, trying to organize a withdrawal, and then the lieutenant was down too, clutching his leg and cursing. The line broke. Men began to fall back, scrambling to the jungle in a desperate attempt to escape the ambush. Thomas fired until his magazine was empty, then reloaded and fired again, covering the retreat as best he could. He did not know how long the firefight lasted. Time seemed to stretch and compress, seconds feeling like hours, and then suddenly it was over. The shooting stopped. The jungle fell silent again, except for groans of the wounded and the sound of footsteps crashing through the undergrowth as the survivors fled. Thomas ran. He did not know which direction he was going, only that he had to get away from the ambush site before the Japanese came to finish off the wounded and search for stragglers. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs felt like they would give out, and then he stopped, collapsing behind a fallen log, gasping for air. He listened. The jungle around him was still. No voices, no movement. He was alone. He checked his gear. His rifle was intact, but he had only 3 magazines left, 30 rounds total. His canteen was half full. He had no food, no map, no radio. His unit was gone, scattered or dead, and he had no idea where the American lines were. He knew the general direction, west toward the ridge, but between him and safety lay miles of jungle controlled by the enemy. He could try to move during the day, but the risk of running into Japanese patrols was too high. He could wait until nightfall, but navigating the jungle in the dark was nearly impossible, and the sounds of movement would give him away. He had a third option, one that seemed insane, but felt right in a way he could not explain. He could stay. He could hunt. The decision came to him not as a sudden flash of inspiration, but as a slow, cold realization that settled over him like the jungle mist. He was behind enemy lines. He was alone, but he was not helpless. He had his rifle, his training, and the skills his father had taught him in the hills of Tennessee. The Japanese were hunting him, but he could hunt them too. He could move through the jungle the way he moved through the woods back home, silent and invisible, striking from unexpected angles, disappearing before they could react. He could make them afraid. He could make them cautious. And maybe, if he was smart and lucky, he could survive long enough to find his way back. He did not think about glory or medals or heroism. He thought only about survival and about the men in his platoon who had not made it out of the ambush. He thought about Robert, his older brother, who was somewhere in North Africa fighting a different war. He thought about his mother's prayer, whispered in the doorway of their farmhouse a lifetime ago. And he made his choice. The first kill came at dusk. Thomas had moved deeper into the jungle, away from the ambush site, and found a cluster of rocky outcroppings that provided cover and a vantage point overlooking a narrow trail. He settled into position, his rifle resting on a flat stone, and waited. The light was fading, the jungle growing dark, and he knew the Japanese would be moving soon, either to establish night positions or to search for survivors. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heartbeat, becoming part of the landscape. He heard them before he saw them, the crunch of boots on dirt, the low murmur of voices speaking Japanese. 3 soldiers appeared on the trail, moving cautiously, their rifles at the ready. They were young, their faces tense, their eyes scanning the jungle. Thomas picked his target, the soldier in the center, and sighted carefully. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle cracked, the recoil pressing into his shoulder. The soldier dropped instantly, a spray of blood marking the spot where the bullet struck. The other two froze for a split second, confusion and fear flashing across their faces, and then they scattered, diving for cover and shouting. Thomas was already moving, slipping away from his position, low and fast, disappearing into the undergrowth before they could return fire. He heard them shouting, calling for help, and then the jungle fell silent again. He did not look back. The second and third kills came the next morning. Thomas had spent the night hidden in a thicket of bamboo, his body aching from the strain of staying motionless, his mind alert to every sound. At first light, he moved again, navigating by the sun and the distant sound of artillery fire that marked the American lines. He found another trail, this one wider, used frequently by Japanese patrols moving supplies and reinforcements. He set up in a tree this time, climbing carefully into the lower branches, his rifle wedged into a fork that provided a stable shooting position. He waited. 2 hours passed. The sun climbed higher, the heat becoming oppressive, sweat dripping into his eyes. Then he heard voices again, and a patrol appeared. 6 men moving in single file, their rifles slung over their shoulders, relaxed and unsuspecting. Thomas knew he could not take them all, but he could hit 2 before they reacted. He aimed at the lead soldier, fired, and the man fell. He shifted his aim, fired again, and the second soldier went down. The others scattered, shouting and firing wildly into the jungle, bullets snapping through the branches around him. Thomas slid down from the tree and ran, his heart pounding, adrenaline flooding his system. He heard them crashing to the undergrowth behind him, but he was faster, and within minutes, he had put enough distance between them to disappear. Over the next 3 days, Thomas became a ghost. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few hours, always hunting, always watching. He learned the rhythms of the Japanese patrols, the routes they used, the times they moved. He learned to read the jungle the way he had read the forests of Tennessee, recognizing the signs of recent passage, the bent grass, the broken branches, the faint impressions of boots in the mud. He set traps using vines and sharpened sticks, crude but effective, catching 2 soldiers who stumbled into them in the dark. He ambushed a 3-man supply party, killing all of them in a matter of seconds and taking their rations and ammunition. He felt no joy in the killing, only a grim determination and a growing sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from a distance, observing the actions of someone else. He counted each kill, marking them in his mind, not out of pride but out of necessity, a way to keep himself grounded, to hold on to something concrete in the chaos. By the end of the 4th day, he had killed 14 men. The Japanese began to change their tactics. Thomas noticed on the 5th day, the patrols were larger, moving more cautiously, their weapons always at the ready. They were searching for him, specifically talking in low voices, pointing at the jungle, setting up ambushes of their own. He overheard them once, hiding in a thicket as a patrol passed within feet of his position, and though he did not understand the words, he understood the tone. They were afraid. They were angry. They wanted him dead. He used their fear against them. He left signs, deliberate marks, a rifle casing placed on a trail, a piece of torn cloth tied to a branch, small clues that suggested his presence and drew them into areas where he had set up firing positions. He became a phantom, a shadow, a story they told each other in the night. He struck from the trees, from the undergrowth, from the rocks, and then vanished before they could respond. He killed a squad leader, a single shot through the head, and watched as the rest of the squad panicked and fired at each other in the confusion. He killed a sentry, slipping up behind in the dark and using his knife, the blade sliding between the ribs, the man dying without a sound. He killed a machine gun crew. 3 men clustered around their weapon, dropping them one after another before they could swing the gun around. By the end of the 6th day, the count had risen to 28. The strain was beginning to show. Thomas had not slept more than a few hours at a time since the ambush, and exhaustion was settling into his bones, a deep weariness that made every movement feel like lifting a weight. His hands shook when he tried to reload his rifle, and his vision blurred at the edges, shapes and shadows bleeding together in the dim light of the jungle. He was running out of ammunition. He had scavenged rounds from the soldiers he killed, but Japanese ammunition did not fit his rifle, and he was down to his last magazine, 10 rounds. He needed to reach the American lines soon, or he would die out here, not from a bullet, but from starvation or disease or simple collapse. But he could not stop. Not yet. The Japanese were still hunting him, and if he moved carelessly, if he let his guard down for even a moment, they would find him. So he kept moving, kept hunting, driven by a will that bordered on madness, a refusal to accept defeat. On the 7th day, he found an opportunity that felt like fate. He was moving along the edge of a clearing, staying low in the undergrowth, when he spotted a Japanese command post. It was a temporary setup, a cluster of tents and supply crates arranged around a central area where officers were gathered, studying maps and shouting orders. There were perhaps 20 soldiers in the camp, too many for him to attack directly. But as he watched, he noticed a pattern. Every 30 minutes, a runner would leave the camp, carrying messages to other units, moving alone down a trail that led into the jungle. Thomas positioned himself along that trail, hidden in a tangle of roots and vines, and waited. The next runner appeared, a young soldier moving quickly, his eyes focused on the path ahead. Thomas stepped out behind him, his knife already in his hand, and struck. The soldier fell without a sound. Thomas dragged the body into the undergrowth, took the message pouch and the soldier's ammunition, and moved on. 30 minutes later, another runner appeared. Thomas killed him the same way. And then another. By the time the camp realized something was wrong, 3 runners were dead, and Thomas was gone, melting back into the jungle like smoke. The kills continued. Thomas ambushed a patrol at a river crossing, dropping 2 men before they could reach cover, and then using confusion to escape downstream. The current carried him away from the gunfire. He set fire to a supply cache, watching from a distance as Japanese soldiers scrambled to put out the flames, and then shot 3 of them as they ran past his position. He killed a sniper who had been harassing American positions, tracking the man through the jungle for hours, following the sound of his rifle, and finally spotting him perched in a tree. Thomas fired once, and the sniper fell, crashing to the branches, his rifle clattering to the ground. By the end of the 8th day, the count had reached 41. Thomas was a living weapon, honed by desperation and survival, his mind sharp and cold, his body moving on instinct and training. He no longer thought about home or family or the future. He thought only about the next target, the next kill, the next moment of survival. On the 9th day, he encountered a Japanese officer. Thomas was hidden in a rocky outcropping overlooking a supply route when a column appeared, soldiers escorting a truck loaded with ammunition and medical supplies. At the front of the column was an officer, distinguished by his uniform and the sword hanging at his side, barking orders and gesturing impatiently. Thomas knew that killing the officer would create chaos, disrupting the column and sending a message that nowhere was safe. He sighted carefully, tracking the officer's movement, waiting for the perfect moment. The officer stopped, turned to shout at one of the soldiers, and Thomas fired. The bullet struck the officer in the chest, and he collapsed, blood spreading across his uniform. The column erupted into chaos. Soldiers diving for cover, shouting and firing blindly into the jungle. Thomas fired again, dropping another soldier, and then a third. And then he was moving, slipping away as the column disintegrated into panic and confusion. He heard them searching for him, crashing through the undergrowth, but he was already gone, a ghost in the jungle. The last 7 kills came on the 10th day. Thomas had been moving steadily west, guided by the sound of artillery and the distant roar of aircraft, signs that he was approaching the American lines. But between him and safety lay one final obstacle, a Japanese defensive position dug into a hillside, blocking the most direct route. He could try to go around, but that would add hours to his journey, and he did not know if he had hours left. His body was failing, his legs barely able to support his weight, his vision tunneling, his mind slipping in and out of focus. He had to go through. He approached the position at midday, when the heat was at its peak and the soldiers would be sluggish and inattentive. He counted 7 men, clustered around a machine gun emplacement, their rifles stacked against a log, their attention focused on the trail below. Thomas circled wide, moving to the dense undergrowth, his breathing shallow and controlled, his movements slow and deliberate. He positioned himself above the emplacement, on a rocky ledge that overlooked their position, and took stock of his remaining ammunition. He had 6 rounds left. He would have to make every shot count. He fired. The first soldier fell. A clean shot to the head. The others reacted instantly, grabbing for their rifles, shouting and scanning the jungle. Thomas fired again, and a second soldier dropped. They spotted his position. The muzzle flashed, giving him away, and bullets began to snap through the air around him, ricocheting off the rocks. Thomas shifted his aim, fired, and a third soldier fell. He rolled to the side as bullets stitched the ground where he had been, dirt and rock exploding around him. He fired again, and a fourth soldier went down. The remaining 3 were panicking, firing wildly, their shots going high and wide. Thomas steadied himself, aimed, and fired. A 5th soldier collapsed. 2 left. He aimed again, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle clicked. Empty. He was out of ammunition. The 2 remaining soldiers were charging up the hill toward him, their rifles raised, shouting as they came. Thomas dropped his rifle and drew his knife, the blade cold and familiar in his hand. He met the first soldier as the man crested the ledge, driving the knife into his throat, the blade sinking deep, blood spraying hot and thick. The soldier fell, and Thomas wrenched the knife free, turning to face the second man. They collided, grappling, the soldier's rifle falling away as they struggled. Thomas was stronger, desperation and adrenaline giving him an edge, and he drove the knife into the soldier's side once, twice, 3 times, until the man went limp and slid to the ground. Thomas stood alone on the hillside, surrounded by the bodies of the 7 men he had just killed, his hands covered in blood, his chest heaving. He had no ammunition, no food, no strength left. But he was alive, and the American lines were just beyond the ridge. He staggered forward, his legs barely supporting him, his vision swimming, the world tilting and spinning around him. He stumbled down the hill, through the jungle, toward the sound of artillery, toward the voices shouting in English, toward safety. He did not remember the last 100 yards. He did not remember collapsing at the edge of the American perimeter, or the hands that caught him, or the voices calling for a medic. He remembered only darkness, and then light, and then the faces of men who looked at him as if he were a ghost. Thomas Hargrove woke up in a field hospital 3 days later. His body was covered in cuts and bruises, his feet infected from wading through swamps, his hands torn and blistered. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive, that he had been suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, and the early stages of malaria. They asked him what had happened, how he had survived, and he told them, speaking slowly, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. He told them about the ambush, about being cut off, about the decision to hunt instead of hide. He told them about the kills, all 48 of them, recounting each one in precise detail, the locations, the tactics, the weapons he used. The officers who interviewed him listened in stunned silence, taking notes, exchanging glances, unable to fully comprehend what they were hearing. One of them asked if he was exaggerating, if perhaps the stress of being isolated had distorted his memory. Thomas looked at him with eyes that were cold and empty and said, "I counted everyone." The story spread to the regiment, and then to the division, and then through the entire island. Men who had never met Thomas Hargrove spoke his name with a mixture of awe and unease. He became a legend, a ghost story told around campfires. The soldier who survived alone in the jungle for 10 days and killed 48 enemy soldiers with nothing but his rifle, his knife, and his will to live. The officers discussed recommending him for a medal, but the bureaucracy of war moved slowly, and the fighting on Guadalcanal continued. Thomas was given a week to recover, and then he was back with his unit, back in the jungle, back to the war. He did not speak much about what had happened. When other soldiers asked him how he had done it, how he had survived, he would shrug and say, "I just kept moving." The Japanese never knew who had been hunting them during those 10 days. They filed reports about a phantom sniper, a ghost in the jungle who struck without warning and vanished without a trace. Some units refused to patrol certain areas, believing them to be cursed or haunted. Intelligence officers on both sides tried to piece together what happened, but the evidence was scattered and incomplete. Bodies found days apart, patrols that never returned, officers killed under circumstances that made no sense. The Americans eventually figured it out, connecting the reports to Thomas Hargrove's account, but the Japanese never did. To them, It remained a mystery, one of the many horrors of the Pacific War that defied explanation. Thomas survived the war. He fought through the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign, and then through New Georgia, and then through the Philippines. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel from a mortar blast, and once by a bullet that passed through his shoulder, but he recovered both times and returned to duty. He was promoted to staff sergeant, and then to platoon leader, and his men followed him with a loyalty born of respect and trust. He never spoke about the 10 days in the jungle unless directly asked, and even then his answers were brief and factual, stripped of emotion or reflection. He carried the weight of those days inside him, a burden that never lightened, a memory that never faded. When the war ended, Thomas returned to Tennessee. He married a woman he had known since childhood, a schoolteacher named Mary who asked no questions about the war and offered only patience and quiet support. They bought a small farm on the outskirts of Knoxville, and Thomas worked the land the way his father had, planting tobacco and raising cattle, living a life that was simple and ordinary. He rarely spoke about the war, even to Mary, and when veterans groups invited him to reunions or ceremonies, he politely declined. He did not want to be remembered as a hero or a legend. He wanted only to be left alone, to live out his days in peace, to forget the things he had seen and done. But the memories never left him. They haunted his dreams, images of faces and bodies, the sound of gunfire, the smell of blood, and jungle rot. He woke in the night sometimes, his heart racing, his hands shaking, and Mary would hold him until the tremors passed, whispering words he could not hear over the roar in his head. Thomas Hargrove died in 1987, at the age of 68, from complications related to lung disease, a legacy of the malaria and infections he contracted during the war. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in the Pacific, noting that he had been awarded the Silver Star and the Purple Heart, but it said nothing about the 10 days in the jungle, nothing about the 48 men he killed. His family knew only fragments of the story, pieces he had shared over the years in moments of weakness or whiskey-fueled honesty. His grandson, a history student, tried to research his grandfather's war record years later, filing requests with the National Archives, searching through unit histories and after-action reports. He found references to a Sergeant Thomas Hargrove, citations for bravery under fire, commendations for leadership, but nothing about the 10 days. The official record was silent, as if those days had never happened, as if the ghost in the jungle had been just that, a ghost. But the story survived. It survived in the memories of the men who served with him, passed down through letters and conversations, told and retold until it became part of the regiment's unofficial history. It survived in the reports filed by Japanese intelligence officers, fragments of a mystery they could never solve. And it survived in Thomas Hargrove himself, in the quiet, unassuming man who walked the hills of Tennessee, who tended his farm and loved his family, and who carried within him the knowledge of what one man could do when survival was the only option left. He had been cut off, isolated, surrounded by enemies who wanted him dead, and it survived not by hiding, not by waiting for rescue, but by becoming something else, something cold and relentless, a hunter in the shadows. He had killed 48 men, and in doing so, he had saved his own life. And when the war was over, he had come home and tried to forget, knowing that forgetting was impossible, that the jungle would always be with him, that the count would always be there, 48 voices that whispered in the dark. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him.